me begin the recording and ask you all to join me in welcoming to this session for the QM East Regional Conference titled Designing for Change, Creating Transformative Online Learning Experiences. So Patrick and Sarah, please go ahead and begin.
Thank you so much, Jillian. You've already introduced everything I was going to say. So thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. We're both from Loyola University of Maryland, and we're going to present some things that we do during the instructional design process. I'm going to give a little bit of philosophical background, and Sarah will get real practical for us. So let's move on to the next slide. So here it is. Your instructions are on there. We have to do this, so you have to participate. In the chat, introduce yourself, tell us who you are, where you're from, what's your role, your administrator, faculty, designer. Awesome. We're all over the country and outside the country. Couple Canada shout outs. Awesome. Bunch of folks here, so this is great. Hi again, Jason. All right, so we got designers, we got a lot of instructors here. That's really exciting. Marilyn, shout out, appreciate that. All right, let's do it, Jillian. We know each other now-ish. So big idea today, structure transforms, kind of setting up the paradox for us here. And we're gonna talk about, what we're going to demonstrate is that if we create an environment that utilizes an organization of opportunities that are based on informed actions and engage students in active learning, it'll result in transformation. So this is a big idea that's going to come up over and over again. Maybe it doesn't make a ton of sense yet, but it will make some sense as we go through. And again, we'll come back. Structure transforms. Jill? So for a lot of you, the basic principles are going to be a lot of things you already believe, that structure, consistency, and clarity are essential. That's pretty much the argument we're always making, I think, in our jobs. But we want to add to that it's not only essential for the learning experience, it's actually essential to engage students in higher level learning. And then we're going to, and Sarah in particular will show 2 design strategies to encourage that higher level learning. So if you're a designer or you're an instructor, we're going to show you how to transform your learning objectives into challenge statements that engage students in active learning. And we're going to take that a step further and talk about how we can rephrase questions into statements and help students engage in informed actions. And these are the things that we say are going to promote transformative learning. And so if you're an administrator and this is something you've wanted to advocate, this is going to be a little bit more evidence for you based on some principles and some practices to move that conversation forward. So next slide. So some more participation from y'all. In a few words, describe the objections you have heard or that you have when it comes to these ideas of structure and consistency and clarity in courses. Right in the chat, put some ideas in there. Sure, just some objections that you have heard or that you have regarding the use of structure, consistency, and clarity Yes, the real world doesn't give you instructions. That's so not true, even though everyone says it. Doesn't fit all situations, sure. Yep. That definitely takes time. Academic freedom, yes. Yeah, sure. Consistency is such drudgery. That's awesome. We have some people blacking out when you hear the word structure. Then they're grad students. They need to figure it out. That's so good. Julie, can you move on to the next slide? Keep the comments coming in. So these are a lot of, oh, this slide's so unorganized. Can you hit the next slide, Jillian? Oh, okay. All right. Now we have a list of things. That's good. Oh, look, there. Thank you, Paula. I don't want to spoon feed them. That's on there. That's the fourth one down. These are college students. These are grad students. The academic freedom, sure. So we predicted from our experience what you guys would say, because that is what people say. I think the big one that we get is that we can't do this because we need to help students develop critical thinking. As someone said, there's no instructions in the real world. We have to develop critical thinkers. So appreciate that good interaction. Got another one for you on the next slide. So this is a simple yes or no. Do most people in higher education believe structure, consistency, and clarity would limit critical thinking? Yes or no in the chat. We've got a couple no's, some yeses, some no's. So this is a majority, so it looks pretty even. Yes, maybe on the verge a little bit, but it's informal. I hope not. Most no. So a little back and forth. Excellent. So as long as this is in the right place, I think we're saying that. So let's dive deeper into this idea about critical thinking in higher education. Next slide. So a lot of the times we do hear the argument that clarity is the enemy of critical thinking. Again, these are college students. The real world doesn't give you instructions. And so the syllogism, as we've engaged with instructors, sort of goes like this. Developing critical thinking skills in students is a primary objective of higher education. It's a good premise. Critical thinking is about making sense from incomplete and ambiguous information. I think we can agree with that. Now, creating ambiguity within a course sets the context for students to hone their critical thinking skills. And therefore, being purposely vague in courses helps students develop into critical thinkers. So that's sort of how the argument goes. So let's see what research is saying about this, Jillian. So this is from the Handbook of Expertise and Expert Performance. Y'all can read. So the takeaway here is that critical thinking is not something that happens because we create ambiguity. Any sort of advanced ability to learn is something that's actually taught, and more specifically, it's taught within a content domain. Next. I agree, Brenda. And so here's another quote from that same text. Continued improvements in achievement are not automatic consequences of more experience. Rather, aspiring experts seek out particular kinds of training tasks designed for basically for themselves by their teachers. So what that's saying is if we think critical thinking is important or higher level learning is important, then someone that's going to become an expert in that is going to need specific training in that. And again, specific training tied to a content area. So next. So we kind of change this syllogism a little bit, and we still think premise 1 and 2 are right, that developing critical thinking is a primary objective of higher education, and critical thinking is about making sense from incomplete information. But what that research shows us is that creating intention within a course sets the context, not ambiguity. And then being purposefully clear is actually what will help students develop into critical thinkers. So next. So this comes back to this idea: structure transforms. And we're going to talk about how in that environment we create these opportunities through structure for transformative learning. Next. So here's the roadmap. We're going to look at some research that we did on the community of inquiry and transformative learning. And that's just going to set a little bit more context for this. And then we're going to kick it over right into the real practical aspects of actually doing activities where we turn objectives into challenge statements and we turn questions into statements. So next slide. Let's do the philosophy. Next. So, have you heard of the community of inquiry? Do you use the community of inquiry as a design framework? In the chat, let us know. Do you use it implicitly, meaning you just kind of use it as a design principle, explicitly, like it's part of a rubric, or not at all, because maybe I've never even heard of it? Cool, so maybe using it in that social presence with the discussion forums. Yep, we were going to talk about what we mean by the community of inquiry in just a second. So a couple people haven't heard of it, so that's really useful. So let's get to the next slide. So the community of inquiry, it's the leading framework used in the design and research of online learning. And basically it's based on collaborative constructivism, and it's based on these three presences of teaching, social, and cognitive. And the thrust is that if we combine these three effectively in an online learning environment, then students will be engaged in the learning process and reach higher level cognitive outcomes. And transformative learning is basically it's a process that people go through where they sort of experience some sort of cognitive disequilibrium. They look for solutions and they come out with different beliefs about something. And so the research into these two, that's fine, theories sets the groundwork for what we're going to talk about next. So the community of inquiry has these three different components: social presence, teaching presence, and cognitive presence. And no, you can go into that slide, that's fine, Jillian. And so it's a total of 34 questions, and the Transformative Learning Survey has 16 questions based on this increasing level of complexity of thinking, habitual action, understanding, reflection, and then the highest level of thinking, critical reflection. So this survey was put out to 579 participants in a MBA program. The font's got a little messed up here, but mostly it was soft disciplines with students of varying online experience. So we can go to the next slide. That just says what that study was about. So we found that the community of inquiry predicts student engagement in transformative learning, and it really significantly so. So the community of inquiry predicts 38% of variance in reflection and 39% of variance in critical reflection. So in other words, if we design courses around the principles of the community of inquiry, we're more likely to engage students in the higher levels of cognition, in particular reflection and critical reflection. So next. And even more specifically, the community of inquiry has statistically significant predictive relationships in this way. So social presence predicts habitual action and understanding. Teaching presence predicts students' engagement in habitual action, understanding, and reflection. And cognitive presence in the community of inquiry predicts understanding, reflection, and critical reflection. So again, the framework as a whole, the community of inquiry, significantly predicts the extent to which students are going to engage in the highest levels of cognition. So if we're designing courses right, we can actually get students to intentionally engage in an active practice of transformative processes. So next slide. So basically where we are so far, the community of inquiry predicts transformative learning. Within the community of inquiry, cognitive presence predicts the transformative elements of reflection and critical reflection. And within the community of inquiry, the teaching presence actually predicts and is the foundation of cognitive presence. So what we're suggesting is that teaching presence is the foundation of transformative learning. Now, I know a lot of you have said you weren't familiar with the community of inquiry. So next slide. So what is teaching presence? Teaching presence is about the organization, the facilitation, and the instruction in the course. And organization is essentially just about course design. That's why it appeals to this sort of audience that's in instructional design. And so these three elements are independent, but they're also interdependent. And so according to students, the design of the course is really the most important thing that happens. It's more important, this idea of teaching presence, this idea that the course is designed well, is more important than actually the teacher being present in the course. That's what the research shows. And it's the most informative in terms of predicting outcomes of all the presences, and it actually predicts 50% of variance in cognitive outcomes. In other words, if we can design our courses right, we can get students purposefully to engage in the highest levels of learning. So that's a lot. Okay, so structure transforms. In the chat, how are you thinking about any of this information right now in terms of design can actually lead to higher levels of learning? What are some initial thoughts that you're taking away so far from this first philosophical part of the presentation?
And while the chat responses are coming in, Patrick, I'm going to field a couple of questions that might be relevant at this particular point. What is the definition of community of inquiry? I think I missed it. And can you give an example? And then another question was, can you please define social presence, teaching presence, and cognitive presence? And I think you're about to do that with the other types of presence other than teaching. And so if that's the case, just let me know. But I thought maybe we could pause it and you could talk about community of inquiry, what it is, and an example, perhaps.
Sure. So that's the framework that we showed. It has the three presences. It's basically just based on, again, collaborative constructivism, and it came out of the study of when distance learning was really becoming sort of computer mediated learning. So students were actually learning not just like in correspondence learning, but actually on computers, and they were at a distance. And the researchers wanted to know, well, how does this actually, what is the fidelity of this experience? In other words, what is the extent to which this is sort of a real learning experience? And so through their research, they ended up coming up with these three presences: the teaching presence, social presence, and cognitive presence. And again, teaching presence is about the design of the course. It's about the role of the instructor organizing the materials, about facilitating the learning, so guiding students along the way, and then actually giving direct instruction, which would be feedback or lectures or helping students uncover their misunderstandings. So that's teaching presence. Social presence is essentially the extent to which you're able to project yourself as an individual within an online learning environment. It's about your ability to communicate openly. It's about the extent of group cohesion within the course and between you and the instructor and you and your classmates. And then cognitive presence is based on Dewey's practical inquiry model, where you move sort of in the way that transformative learning moves from lower levels of cognition to higher levels. So there's a triggering event, there's investigation, there's sort of exploration of ideas, and then finally a resolution of this cognitive challenge. And so the goal really of the community of inquiry is to design an experience where students can project who they are and collaborate with each other, and then really reach that highest level of cognition, which is resolution of cognitive challenges.
Thank you.
Yeah, Beth, we totally agree. And as Sarah gets into her specifics, going to really show how we can eliminate a lot of that frustration and a lot of that extraneous cognitive load. Awesome. Thank you, guys. So that was the philosophical sort of heavy duty stuff. And Sarah's actually going to get us real practical. She's going to help us land the plane and something that we can do in our classes. So again, structure transforms, and I'm going to kick it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Patrick. So again, the big idea that we're talking about is that the environment is important in the structure, the consistent layouts, and clear instructions. With that, we turn towards the opportunities. We want to zoom in on the opportunities, specifically how to transform some learning objectives into challenge statements, and then we're going to look at how to rephrase some of your questions into statements. So if we could move to the next slide. Thank you. When you think about the types of opportunities you offer your students to demonstrate their knowledge or assess their understanding and measure their performance, how are those opportunities presented in your course? What is the phrasing that you're utilizing to present those specific opportunities? Does each opportunity include student self-awareness in connections between a learning objective and an assignment? At Loyola, we set a bar very high for quality by developing active learning opportunities in a positively structured environment. And to do so, we intentionally transform learning objectives into challenge statements and organize assignment instructions as informed actions rather than questions. So Jillian, if we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So let's start with challenge statements as a key active learning element in the environment. For many courses, learning objectives tend to be presented in isolation, such as the example on the left. So typically we state a learning objective, but fail to provide much context as to how it will actually be applied or how students will be assessed. So students fail to miss the connection between that important objective and the purpose of an assignment. More so, sometimes when we state our objectives, we're saying that this is the checkbox, this is the ceiling in which you need to reach, whereas students would really appreciate the objective being the ground, enabling them to transform knowledge. So to look at this a little deeper, in the example on the left-hand side, the objective says, it's kind of hard to read, to examine and analyze different approaches to reading the Bible is presented first. But it has little context and is essentially in isolation, unconnected to an activity or assignment. Again, due to this limitation, students will miss or fail to connect the purpose of the assignment, which is all the way down in the bottom left-hand corner that says weekly essay number 1. Students will fail to connect that session objective to the purpose of that assignment. And instead, they'll probably think that the objective of that assignment is just to complete it. Sometimes in our course designs, we just say complete assignment 1, or complete exam 1, complete this discussion forum, which is not active learning. So to support a student's self-awareness in their cognitive development, think about positioning your objectives as the ground for which students can transform the content into new ideas, skills, and solutions. So to do this, on the right-hand side, you can create and present challenge statements. Challenge statements are important because they stimulate active learning and they support self-awareness and the connections between objectives and assignments. So in this example, it says, analyze the important, or what the, analyze, I can't read the slide. It's so little.
Sarah, I can read it for you. It's
Thank you. My internet's like shaking.
sure. It's the under assignments. It says analyze 2 approaches to reading the Bible in Reading a Sacred Text discussion forum.
Thank you. So moving forward, how can we create a challenge statement? So first, you want to identify your measurable learning objectives and align each objective to an assignment or activity. In your course, you might have a list of activities and assignments such as these, forums, lesson plans, quizzes. After discussing the purpose of each assignment, determine your appropriate learning objective. Step 2 is to form a statement that connects the learning objective and the assignment. Again, in this example, to analyze 2 approaches to reading the Bible in Reading a Sacred Text discussion forum. Now we are informing students of the connection between an objective and the purpose of an assignment, as well as informing them at the point in which the course their performance of the objective will be measured. Again, so the objective is no longer in isolation from the actual assignment. It's connected, making those connections clear to students as well. So let's turn the corner and have you try. In the chat box, connect the following 3 learning objectives and 3 types of assignments to create challenge statements. We provided the example from the previous slides at the bottom.
So Brenda has a question. The challenge statement doesn't replace the learning objective, correct?
No, it's actually strengthening the objective, the presence of it for a student within the course. So you want to use similar wording as your objective in your statement. Great, Lisa. Excellent, Mark. Right, so for each assignment that you have in your course, you want to provide a challenge statement to ignite active learning for students to find solutions. And as you have provided excellent examples, so test your understanding or discuss the most valuable thing. Now you're informing your students what you want them to do, which is excellent. So if we flip to the next slide, please, Jillian. Thank you. The takeaways for transforming your learning objectives into challenge statements is that, again, they stimulate active learning for students to find solutions, which in turn heightens their executive functioning, and students are immediately informed about the connection between an objective and an activity or assignment. Again, this scaffolds their cognitive development. Another huge benefit with COI, community inquiry, is that instructors become clear in their assignments of purpose and supporting a strong teaching presence. So next on our roadmap is rephrasing questions into statements. Examples of common question starters found in instructions are presented here. So do you agree or disagree with? Are you familiar with a situation in which this theory can be applied? Can you explain how to do something? Do you know which of the following items is incorrect? Would you respond in the same manner as this theorist or as this person? But the problem is that the pattern of behavioral responses with the lead-ins of can you, do you, are you, are the closed-ended response of yes and no, which then restricts students' ability to actually demonstrate their knowledge and transform knowledge. But then again, at the bottom, there's the question starter of how can you? So for example, how can a company define this principle? I mean, I would respond with a company can define it in text, and technically that would be right. But if Jillian, if you don't mind pressing enter, please. We can strengthen, thank you, we can strengthen the learning experience by rephrasing questions into statements. And why this works is because statements are informative. They fill in the conditions for when, so first identify, then describe, or first summarize, then apply, as well as provide a focus on the content, increasing the stickiness for students, which is great. Such clear statements prepare students for transforming information into real-world applications. So to do this, from our examples, instead of do you agree or disagree, and you answer yes and earn full credit, write a line of instruction to explain whether you agree or disagree. Rather than are you familiar with, try describe a situation to apply a theory. Rather than can you explain, well, technically, yes, I can explain, thank you for asking. Instead, try explain the process of something. A question starter not listed on the slide but is common is what are? So for example, what are the steps to calculate slope when you don't have an equation? Instead of what are, because I could respond they are short and technically answer the question, try list 3 steps to calculate slope when you don't have an equation. With this small change in rephrasing questions into statements, you are and should strive to connect the content with measurable objectives. Statements become intentional motivators supporting the active learning environment. And as the instructor, you then direct the conversation and inform students to find solutions. To return to an earlier discussion in our presentation, some faculty, as we presented, do argue that critical thinking skills are gambled when we inform students of these conditions to transform their knowledge. However, as we make clear, critical thinking requires clarification in the meaning of your words and avoiding ambiguity. Ambiguity is what is actually often conveyed through ill-formed questions, preventing students from transforming their knowledge and demonstrating their understanding. So if you want students to learn critical thinking skills, model those skills with clear, intentional statements as form starters and assignment instructions. So to practice, the next slide, please. Thank you. In the chat box, let's practice rephrasing some of the questions into an informed action. And we provide an example there for you. But if you have others from your courses that you'd like to try, that'd be great too. So if you have an example of a question that you commonly ask in a discussion forum or assignment, please share it and show how you could transition it into an informed action. Okay, excellent. Yes, yes, excellent. So describe and explain and apply and list 3 steps. So by transforming these questions into informed actions, you are now encouraging students to be active learners, encouraging them to find solutions, which are our takeaways on the next slide, please, Jillian. Thank you. So again, we're informing students, we are supporting active learning to find solutions, and finding solutions increases the number of opportunities presented in an educational experience, and in turn elevates higher order thinking processes. Again, all important goals of higher education. So to return to the big idea, just to reiterate our message that there is an importance of structure and consistency and clarity within an environment. And through those elements, we can provide organization of opportunities based on informed actions, which will engage students in active learning and result in transformation of knowledge. So no matter what you do, we know that it's the structure, the consistency, and clear environment, coupled with the opportunities that you provide students that will support their ability to transform knowledge. And for instructors, you're supporting your teaching presence. So for this presentation, if you're an instructor or designer, now you know how to stimulate active learning by transforming your objectives into challenge statements and rephrasing questions into informed action statements. And through our philosophies and framework, our arguments provide administrators the necessary resources to support structure and clarity at your institution. So with that, we'd like to open it, say thank you and open it for questions.
Thank you so very much for letting me know I'm on mute. I do apologize for that. I put the link to the session surveys here in the chat, and I'll put that in there again. And I want to thank Patrick and Sarah for their presentation. And we do have a couple of questions that came in while I was talking and thought you were all hearing me. So can you talk more about cognitive presence? How is that different from knowledge acquisition is the first question. And there's another one I can read to you once we answer the cognitive presence question.
Could you just explain a little bit what you're thinking about with that term, knowledge acquisition?
Okay, we'll let Stephen add more information either in the chat, Stephen, or you can add that to the question, or I may be able to allow you to talk here. So let me go over here. Oh, there Stephen is. And we do have about 10 minutes left. So Stephen, while you're typing more or getting your mic on, I can let folks know they can add more questions if they'd like, because we do have about 10 minutes left. And while Stephen might be adding some more information about that knowledge acquisition, okay, here he did come back with some more there. I mean, by knowledge acquisition, I mean the integration of knowledge by the learner, i.e. what is the difference between a Petrarchan and Shakespearean sonnet?
I don't even know what those words mean. So the example flies over my head. Again, cognitive presence was based on Dewey's formulation of how people come to acquire knowledge. So I would just say that it is one type of understanding of how human cognition functions. Real tight connections to Piaget and the difference between assimilation and accommodation. And the idea of, thinking or accessing the world through schema, and how do we make sense of information that doesn't fit the schema. That's generally how Piaget and Dewey approached it. And then, of course, through the community of inquiry, they kind of take that same line.
Okay, thank you. Looking at our question pod, more are coming in here. What if research doesn't convince faculty who are reluctant to add social to courses? Their subject is different in quotation marks.
Yeah, so we get that a lot. Obviously, you get your accounting folks, economic folks sometimes that are just like, they just need to solve the problems. And so we don't want to confuse social with group work, although group work could be work in that context. And we don't want to confuse it with just talking about real world application, like in a discussion forum. So oftentimes in those courses, we'll encourage faculty to use discussions as a place for students to kind of share their responses and then offer peer review. And which makes it a lot easier for the instructor actually to give feedback to everyone at once because it's in a public forum, as opposed to correcting a calculation, an equational mistake that 30 people make the same one. If they're sharing it in a space, that will work to increase social presence, and it will make the instructor's life that much easier.
Thank you. No more questions have come in. I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording.